The entire ballroom went silent, not gradually, not politely. All at once, the way a candle snuffs out in a sudden wind, 300 members of the ton simply stopped. And into that silence, the Duke of Callum, the most powerful, most sought after, most catastrophically unmarried man in all of England, pressed a bouquet of 12 white roses into the hands of entirely the wrong woman. The wrong woman stared down at the flowers, then up at the Duke, then down at the flowers again. "You," she said, her voice admirably steady for someone whose life had just detonated, "have made a tremendous mistake." "Yes," said the Duke, dark eyes holding hers without a flicker of remorse. "I'm beginning to find I don't mind it." Somewhere behind her, she heard her sister begin to scream. There are two kinds of women who attend the season. The first kind arrives in silk and expectation. She has been prepared for this, powdered and primped, and told since childhood that she is magnificent, that the world will arrange itself around her beauty like iron filings around a magnet. She has memorized which fork to use, how to laugh without showing too many teeth, and precisely how long to hold a gentleman's gaze before looking demurely away. She is, in the parlance of the ton, a diamond. The second kind arrives in last year's muslin, holds someone else's reticule, and spends the evening standing 2 feet behind the diamond, fetching lemonade, deflecting unwanted suitors with quiet efficiency, and pretending she finds the whole enterprise utterly fascinating, when she would, in fact, rather be at home reading. This is the story of the second kind of woman. Her name was Miss Florence Bartlett. She was 23, which the ton considered almost offensively old for a woman not yet wed. She had brown hair of no particular distinction, eyes that were, depending on the light, either gray or green or simply stubborn, and a mouth that her Aunt Golda had described on multiple occasions as altogether too clever for a young lady without a fortune. She had no fortune, she had no prospects, she had no mother, that lady having departed the world when Florence was 11, and no father either, that gentleman having followed his wife into eternity 2 years later, leaving Florence to the dubious mercies of her uncle Victor Bartlett, her Aunt Golda, and their daughter, the Diamond herself. Miss Ruby Bartlett. Ruby was everything Florence was not. Golden-haired, wide-eyed, possessed of a laugh like small silver bells, and a temperament like a summer storm, all brightness and warmth until the moment the clouds rolled in, and then absolutely devastating. She was the undisputed diamond of this season. Every gossip sheet agreed, every matchmaking mamma concurred, and the entire ton had assembled at Lord and Lady Rogehevel's grand summer ball with the cheerful expectation of watching the diamond secured by the highest bidder. That bidder was expected, universally, breathlessly, with the confidence of a foregone conclusion, to be Jonathan Keynes, the Duke of Callum. Now, the Duke. If Florence was the kind of woman the ton overlooked, the Duke was the kind of man it feared. Not in the cowering sense, though several lesser gentlemen had reportedly gone pale in his presence, but in the way one fears a storm on the horizon, magnificent, inevitable, and entirely capable of ruining your afternoon. He was 28. He had inherited the dukedom at 19 following the death of his father, a man the gossips described as colourful and the estate ledgers described as catastrophically irresponsible, and had spent the intervening years rebuilding the Callum fortune with a ferocity that had made him powerful, respected, and almost entirely humourless. Almost. His secretary, Mr. Will Thompson, claimed the Duke possessed wit. His estate manager claimed the Duke possessed intelligence. His housekeeper claimed the Duke possessed a fondness for dogs and lemon tarts that would utterly ruin his terrifying reputation if it ever got out. But to the Ton, the Duke of Callum was simply the prize. Whoever secured him secured everything: title, fortune, consequence, and a very large house in Wiltshire. Ruby Bartlett had been told she would secure him. Ruby Bartlett had believed it entirely. She had not, in any of her calculations, accounted for her cousin, Florence. Then again, nobody ever did. In which a chaperone commits the unforgivable act of having opinions. The Rochehevel ball was objectively a masterpiece of excess. Florence had been to enough of these events to recognize the particular species of grandeur on display, the kind designed not to delight the guests, but to intimidate them. Lady Rochehevel had hung approximately 400 candles from the ceiling of her ballroom, and the cumulative effect was less enchanting and more, "I am standing inside the sun." The flowers alone, white lilies and cascading jasmine, and something Florence could not identify that smelled aggressively of tuberose, had clearly cost more than Florence's annual allowance, which was not, admittedly, a high bar. "You're doing it again," said Ruby, without looking at her. Florence, who had been attempting to quietly catalogue the number of chandelier crystals on the nearest fixture, blinked. "Doing what?" "That." Ruby gestured vaguely at Florence's face. "That look where you're thinking things. It makes you look disagreeable." "I was counting the crystals." "Why?" "Because I find it calming." Ruby stared at her with the particular horror of someone who has just discovered their companion is slightly feral. "Florence, we are standing in the most coveted ballroom in London. The Duke of Callum is expected within the hour. There are no fewer than 6 countesses watching every woman in this room for signs of weakness, and you are counting crystals." "There are 342, Florence said, "on that chandelier alone. I expect the room total is somewhere around 4,000. Ruby's eyes narrowed to something approaching murder. "You are doing this deliberately." "I truly am not. I find the crystals far more interesting than—" Florence caught herself. Do not say "than the Duke." Even in jest, that was the sort of remark that could ricochet badly. "Then standing here waiting to be inspected." "I am not waiting to be inspected. I am waiting to be admired." Florence opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Yes," she said carefully, "of course." Ruby's expression shifted into something softer, more uncertain, and in those brief, unguarded moments, Florence was always reminded that her cousin was, beneath all the performance, genuinely afraid of failing, afraid of a season that had been promised to her like a birthright, only to find that birthrights, like all inheritances, could be snatched away. Florence felt a pang of something uncomfortably close to sympathy. Then Aunt Golda arrived. Golda Bartlett was a woman constructed entirely from ambition and whalebone corsetry. She had the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who had spent 30 years calculating social advantage, and she swept into Florence's field of vision like a ship under full sail, magnificent, purposeful, and absolutely determined to flatten anything in her path. "He's arrived," she said without preamble. Ruby's spine straightened instantly, her chin lifted. The performance resumed so quickly it was almost frightening. "Where?" said Ruby.
"Entrance hall. He's speaking to Lord Rochevel. He will enter the ballroom within minutes." Golda's eyes cut to Florence with the warmth of a January window. "You, stay back. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not block Ruby's sight lines, and for the love of all that is holy, do not say whatever you are currently thinking." "I was thinking," Florence said, "that the tuberose is slightly overpowering." "Florence, it genuinely is. Someone is going to faint. That someone will not be you, because you will be standing quietly by the refreshment table, being invisible, which is what you are here for." Golda smoothed her gloves with the efficiency of a general reviewing her troops. "Now, positions." Florence took her position. The refreshment table was, at least, strategically excellent. It offered an unobstructed view of the entire ballroom, immediate access to lemonade, and enough distance from the main action that Florence could observe proceedings with the detached interest of someone watching a theatrical performance rather than participating in one. She collected a glass of lemonade. She found a marble pillar of adequate width. She arranged herself beside it in the way she had perfected over 3 seasons of chaperone duty, present enough to be technically available, invisible enough to be practically absent. And then the Duke of Callum walked in. Florence had, of course, seen him before. London was not so large that their paths hadn't crossed, at assemblies, at theatre performances, at the sort of morning rides in Hyde Park where the entire ton processed in a slow circle like very well-dressed planets orbiting the same sun. She had formed opinions about him the way one forms opinions about weather, observable, relevant to one's plans, not particularly personal. But she had not, she realized now, been paying attention. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was simply that the room arranged itself around him in a way that made him seem larger. He wore black evening dress with the studied disinterest of someone who knows perfectly well that they look devastating and has long since stopped finding it interesting. His jaw was, Florence searched for a neutral adjective and found it, pronounced. His eyes, from this distance, were dark and sweeping, and currently cataloguing the room with an expression that managed to convey both perfect social awareness and complete personal boredom simultaneously. He was, Florence thought, with the same distant objectivity with which she'd counted the crystals, extremely good-looking. Then she thought, and he knows it, which ruins it somewhat. Then she thought, stop thinking about the Duke and drink your lemonade. She drank her lemonade. She watched Ruby perform the exact sequence of artful non-acknowledgement that Aunt Golda had rehearsed with her. The graceful turn, the laugh at precisely the right moment, the flash of golden hair catching the candlelight at an angle that was, if Florence was being honest, genuinely impressive stagecraft. The Duke moved through the room. He accepted greetings. He endured introductions. He did not, notably, smile once, though he managed to project an air of civil attention that was almost as good. Lady Rochevelle, a magnificent woman of 60, with the bearing of an empress and the social instincts of a hawk, materialized at his elbow and began to steer him, with practiced subtlety, toward the section of the room where Ruby stood. Florence tracked the trajectory. It was going exactly as planned. In approximately 4 minutes, the Duke would reach Ruby, the flowers he was carrying, 12 perfect white roses, because of course he had brought courtship flowers to the most visible event of the season. The man was nothing if not deliberate, would be presented, and the matter of the season's most anticipated match would be set in motion. Florence finished her lemonade. She set down her glass. She turned very slightly to examine a nearby floral arrangement that was, she now confirmed, absolutely too heavy on the tuberose, and walked directly into a wall. Except the wall was warm and wearing a cravat, and made a low sound of surprised breath at the impact. Florence stepped back and looked up. The Duke of Callum looked down. He was, at this proximity, rather more alarming than she'd accounted for. Not frightening. Florence had no particular talent for being frightened of things that were merely powerful, but present in a way that demanded acknowledgement. His dark eyes had dropped from politely distant social awareness to something sharper, the look of someone who had just had their attention genuinely, unexpectedly caught. He still had the roses. Florence stepped back. She lifted her chin. She said, because she was constitutionally incapable of not saying things, "My apologies. I was inspecting the floral arrangement and failed to account for the Duke standing directly behind me." One dark brow rose approximately 3 millimeters.
You were inspecting the arrangement.
The tuberose is excessive. I suspect Lady Rochevelle's florist went slightly mad with the order. It will give half the room a headache by 11 o'clock. She paused. Your Grace. The Your Grace was, she was aware, somewhat belated. Aunt Golda would be furious. The Duke did not look offended. He looked, and this was unexpected, amused, or something adjacent to amused. The expression was so unfamiliar on his face that it took Florence a moment to categorize it. "You may be right," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice of someone who did not waste words. I noticed it from the entrance hall. "Did you? I thought perhaps I was simply sensitive to it. My cousin believes I notice things that are better left unnoticed." "Your cousin?" "Miss Ruby Bartlett." Florence tilted her head in Ruby's direction helpfully. "I believe you were making your way toward her. She is considerably more decorative than the floral arrangement and smells significantly better." She paused. "That came out less elegantly than I intended." For one extraordinary moment she thought the Duke might actually laugh. He didn't, but the almost laugh was there, a brief involuntary shift at the corner of his mouth, and it did something entirely inconvenient to Florence's carefully maintained sense of detached observation. "You are her cousin," he said, not a question. He was looking at her with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. "I had understood there was a chaperone." "I am the chaperone." Both brows rose now. "You are 23 at most." 23 exactly. My aunt found a professional chaperone too expensive and a family member too convenient to resist. Here I am. Florence retrieved a second glass of lemonade from a passing footman. She felt she'd earned it, and held it with the composure of someone who absolutely had not just told the Duke of Calam her precise age within 90 seconds of introduction. "Miss Florence Bartlett, wallflower, crystal counter, floral critic, at your service." The Duke was quiet for precisely 2 seconds. "Jonathan Calam," he said. "Duke, apparently former destination." His eyes moved briefly to where Lady Rochevelle had been steering him, then back to Florence. "Your cousin is expecting me." "She is, as is half of London." Florence kept her voice perfectly pleasant. "Shall I step aside, Your Grace, or shall we continue discussing the tuberose?" It was the right thing to say, the gracious thing, the self-effacing, appropriate, chaperone-appropriate thing. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "The tuberose," he said. "Since you've raised it, do you genuinely believe it will cause headaches, or are you being provocative?" Florence blinked. Of all the responses available to him, "Both," she said honestly. "The oil is genuinely quite strong, but I also found it a more interesting opening remark than 'good evening.'" It was a better opening remark than 'good evening.' "Than most opening remarks at these things, frankly. 'Good evening. Lovely weather. Have you been in town long? Nobody ever asks anything remotely—" She stopped. She had been about to say, "interesting." She looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at her. The roses were still in his hand, white and immaculate, and becoming increasingly relevant to the conversation purely by virtue of their conspicuous presence. "Nobody ever asks anything remotely what?" said the Duke of Calam, and his voice had shifted from politely bemused to genuinely curious, and that, Florence thought, was going to be a problem, because she could feel, with the particular instinct of someone who has spent 3 seasons watching other women make precisely this error, that this conversation had gone on approximately 2 minutes longer than it should have. And somewhere across the ballroom she could feel Aunt Golda's gaze on her back like a brand. "Remotely worth answering," Florence said crisply, "which is why most people don't. It was a pleasure, Your Grace. My cousin will be— What do you find worth answering?" He said it without urgency, without flirtation, with the simple, direct quality of someone who had decided they wanted an answer to a question and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Florence opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again.
Around them, the ballroom continued its glittering rotation, dancers and gossip, and the clink of crystal, and the distant, relentless performance of an entire society arranging and rearranging itself in pursuit of advantage. 300 people, none of whom were paying particular attention to the wallflower by the pillar and the Duke who had momentarily forgotten where he was going. None of them except, Florence realized, with a cold drop of certainty in her stomach, the woman 3 feet to her left who had just turned from her own conversation, glass of champagne arrested halfway to her lips, eyes wide with the dawning, furious comprehension of someone watching something go catastrophically wrong. Lady Prudence Dynevor, London's most prolific gossip, keeper of more social ruin than any one person had a right to, was staring directly at Florence Bartlett and the Duke of Callum. And she was smiling. Florence said, with crisp, desperate pragmatism, "Your Grace, I genuinely recommend you go speak to my cousin now." The Duke followed her gaze to Lady Dynevor. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition of the precise social danger she was flagging. "Lady Dynevor," he said. "She has already composed the first sentence of tomorrow's column in her head," Florence said. "I can tell by the angle of her chin. Please, take your roses and go." The Duke looked at Lady Dynevor. Then he looked at Florence. Then, and she would never be entirely able to explain what happened in the half-second that followed, he looked down at the roses in his hand, as if he had genuinely, temporarily, forgotten they existed. "Right," he said, and he held them out to Florence. The entire ballroom went silent. Florence stared down at 12 white roses. She looked up at the Duke, who appeared to be experiencing the particular expression of a man who has just heard himself say something and is only now, in real time, fully processing its implications. Behind her, 3 feet away, then 2, then 1, she heard her cousin, Ruby Bartlett, make a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a scream, but contained meaningful elements of both. Lady Dynevor's smile had achieved magnificence that Florence found genuinely awe-inspiring, even as her own world quietly disassembled itself around her. She looked at the Duke. "You," she said, her voice admirably steady for someone whose life had just detonated, "have made a tremendous mistake." "Yes," said the Duke, dark eyes holding hers without a flicker of remorse. "I'm beginning to find I don't mind it." Somewhere behind her, her sister, her cousin, began to scream. "In which the wrong sister is congratulated, the right sister is furious, and the Duke is suspiciously unhelpful." Ruby did not technically scream. She produced a sound that occupied the precise acoustic territory between a wounded dove and a tea kettle, which was somehow worse, refined enough to be socially acceptable, raw enough to communicate absolute devastation. It was, Florence thought wildly, an impressive piece of performance even by Ruby's considerable standards. Around them the ballroom had not resumed. 300 members of the Ton had collectively decided that whatever was happening near the refreshment table was infinitely more interesting than dancing, drinking, or the business of their own lives. Florence could feel the attention of the room like a physical pressure, a gathering weight, the social equivalent of a storm front rolling in, and she stood in the center of it, holding 12 white roses and trying very hard not to visibly panic. She did not panic visibly. This was one of the few genuine advantages of having spent 3 seasons being entirely overlooked. She had developed an excellent poker face. "Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice low and her expression pleasant, "I think there has been a—" Lady Dynevor materialized at her elbow with the speed of a woman who has been waiting 30 years for a moment this good. She was 60-something, powdered, magnificent, and absolutely incandescent with delight. "What a remarkable evening this is turning out to be," Lady Dynevor said.
"Those are lovely roses." Lady Dynavor's eyes were moving between Florence and the Duke with the focused appetite of a hawk that has just spotted something exceptional in a field. "Aren't they lovely, Callum?" The Duke, to his credit, or rather to his absolute infuriating lack of remorse, appeared entirely composed. "Exceptionally so." "From your own gardens at Callum Park, if I'm not mistaken. You always bring the white roses. Your mother's tradition, wasn't it? The late Duchess always said white roses meant—" "Serious intention," said Florence, because she had unfortunately read enough gossip columns to know this fact, and now wished devoutly that she hadn't. "Yes, I am aware." "Are you?" Lady Dynavor's smile achieved a new dimension. "How thorough of you." Florence turned to the Duke with the focused intensity of someone who needs a specific thing to happen immediately. "Your Grace, a word." "Certainly. Privately." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, unreadable eyes, and then, God help her, he offered her his arm. Which meant she had to take it, because refusing the arm of a duke in the middle of a ballroom in front of 300 witnesses was the kind of social maneuver that made things worse, and Florence had already hit her quota for making things worse this evening. She took his arm. She smiled at Lady Dynevor with every ounce of pleasantness she possessed. She let the Duke of Calem lead her toward the relative privacy of the room's perimeter, and she did this while still holding his roses, which meant that to every person watching, and every person was watching, it looked exactly like what it was: a courtship declaration, publicly made, publicly accepted. Florence waited until they had achieved a reasonable distance from the nearest set of ears, and then she turned to him with the expression of someone exercising enormous restraint. "You need to go back," she said quietly. "Right now. You need to go back. You need to tell Lady Dynevor that the flowers were intended for my cousin, and you need to present them to Ruby before the gossip leaves this room, which," she glanced at the nearest cluster of whispering women, "gives you approximately 45 seconds." The Duke appeared to be thinking. "The gossip," he said, "has almost certainly already left this room. Lady Dynevor was composing her account before I had finished extending my arm." Florence stared at him. "You could still correct it." "I could say the flowers were intended for another woman," he agreed, "which would mean I had just publicly presented courtship flowers to the wrong recipient, suggesting either incompetence or intoxication, neither of which does my reputation any particular good. Or, do not say or. Or I allow the evening to proceed as it appears to have proceeded, and address the matter with considerably more control in the morning." Florence stared at him. "You are," she said carefully, "describing a strategy. I am describing an alternative to publicly embarrassing us both within the same 3 minutes. You have already publicly embarrassed—" She stopped, breathed, restarted. "Your Grace, I am a chaperone. I have no fortune, no title, no consequence, and no expectation of making a match this season or any other. My cousin, however—" "Your cousin," said the Duke, "will be perfectly fine." "My cousin," said Florence with tremendous precision, "is currently standing 20 feet away doing something to her champagne glass that I genuinely fear for." They both looked. Ruby was not, in fact, doing anything to her champagne glass. She was standing in rigid, magnificent stillness, her golden head high, her expression the careful blankness of someone experiencing a volcanic internal event and containing it through sheer force of trained composure. Beside her, Aunt Golda wore the face of a woman watching a carriage accident in extremely slow motion. Florence felt a pang, a genuine one. Whatever Ruby's faults, and they were considerable and well catalogued, she had been told this was hers. She had been prepared for this exact evening, this exact moment, like a racehorse trained for a single race. and she had just watched it handed to someone else entirely. Florence understood, better than most, what it felt like to have things taken from you. She turned back to the Duke with renewed purpose. "Fix it," she said. "Please." Something crossed his face. Not guilt precisely. This was not a man who wore guilt comfortably, but something more complicated. His gaze moved between Florence and the corner where Ruby stood, and Florence had the unsettling impression that he was calculating something she didn't have enough information to understand. "Give me the roses," she said. "I'll tell everyone I admired them and ask to hold them for a moment. It's thin, but Lady Dynevor can be managed if we— Miss Bartlett, move quickly, and I accept full responsibility for the confusion, which I'm happy to do, because it will be true. I did walk into you, which started the whole Miss Bartlett." She stopped. The Duke was looking at her with an expression that was, she realized with slowly dawning dismay, somewhere in the vicinity of decided. "Keep the roses," he said. Silence. "I beg your pardon?" "For this evening," he said. "Keep the roses, allow the situation to stand as it is, and I give you my word that tomorrow, in the cold light of morning, we will between us devise a sensible resolution. Tonight, attempting to untangle this publicly will cause considerably more damage than leaving it." Florence looked at the roses in her hands. She looked at the Duke. She looked at 300 aristocrats who were, with varying degrees of subtlety, watching this conversation with the fixed intensity of people who intended to discuss it for the next 6 weeks. She thought about Aunt Golda's face. She thought about Ruby's rigid, terrible stillness. She thought about the 45-second window that had now definitively closed. "You realize," she said, "that you have just ruined my life. I have complicated it. There is a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." "No," he said, and something in his voice shifted, a thread of something that was almost apology, almost acknowledgement, almost human. "I don't imagine there is." Florence looked at him for one long moment. Then she looked down at the roses, 12 perfect white blooms that smelled of his garden in Wiltshire, and the complete destruction of every plan she had never quite allowed herself to make. She should put them down, on the nearest surface, walk away, find Ruby, perform whatever damage control remained available, and spend the rest of the evening pretending to be invisible. She should. She didn't. She kept the roses. She told herself it was pragmatism. She was, in this particular instance, entirely lying to herself. The carriage ride home was the longest 40 minutes of Florence Bartlett's life. This was not because of the silence. The silence would have been manageable. It was because the silence lasted precisely 4 seconds before Aunt Golda ended it, and then the absence of silence became the problem. "Explain," said Aunt Golda. One word, delivered with the compression of a woman packing 30 years of social ambition into a single syllable. "There was a misunderstanding," Florence said. "A misunderstanding?" "I walked into him near the refreshment table. He handed you the flowers?" Golda's voice was extraordinarily controlled. It was the control of a structure that has been placed under significant stress and is managing, for now, to hold. "He handed you the flowers, and then he walked with you to the perimeter, and you spoke to him for how long? How long were you speaking to him?" Florence did not calculate. 10 minutes, perhaps. The structure showed its first crack. 10 minutes? It wasn't intended to be— "I was not addressed," said Ruby. It was the first thing Ruby had said since they left the ball. Her voice was very quiet, which was considerably more frightening than shouting. She was looking out the carriage window at the dark London street with the expression of someone engaged in an internal negotiation with a very difficult emotion. "Ruby, He did not speak to me once, not once. He looked at me twice from a distance, and then he spent 10 minutes discussing—" She turned from the window. "What? What were you discussing that was so urgent, Florence? What could you possibly have to say to the Duke of Callum for 10 minutes?" The tuberose, Florence thought, and had the good sense not to say. "Nothing of significance," she said instead. "Truly, we spoke about the flowers and the arrangement, and I tried repeatedly to end the conversation and redirect him toward— And yet you kept the roses," Ruby said. Florence looked down. She was still holding them. She had, in the chaos of departure, simply kept them, and now they sat in her lap in the darkened carriage like evidence of a crime. He suggested, Golda repeated, and the structure cracked further. "The Duke of Callum suggested, and you obeyed. You who have spent 3 seasons learning to be invisible, who have precisely nothing to offer a man of his standing, who were brought along specifically to not interfere." "Mother," said Ruby quietly. "And you managed, within the span of an hour—" "Mother." Ruby's voice was still quiet, but there was something steel-threaded in it now. "Enough." Golda stopped. Ruby looked at Florence, and Florence looked back, and for a moment, just a moment, the cousins regarded each other across the distance of a shared, difficult life. "You didn't intend this," Ruby said. "It wasn't entirely a question." "No," said Florence. "I swear to you, I didn't." Ruby held her gaze for another beat. Then she looked out the window again. "It doesn't matter whether you intended it. It happened. Lady Dynevor will have it in every drawing-room by breakfast." She paused. "The question now is what we do about it." This was, Florence thought, the most pragmatic thing Ruby had ever said in her presence. It was also, somehow, the most frightening, because Ruby approaching a situation with cold pragmatism rather than warm emotion meant Ruby was furious, and a furious Ruby who had decided to be strategic was an entirely different proposition from a furious Ruby who simply raged. Florence held the roses. The carriage rattled through the London dark. The Duke, she thought, had better have a very good plan by morning. He did not, as it turned out, have a plan by morning. He had something considerably more inconvenient. He had a proposal. In which a duke arrives uninvited, a bargain is struck, and Florence makes the worst decision of her life, or possibly the best. He arrived at 9 in the morning. This was, by ton standards, practically the middle of the night. Respectable calls were made between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. 9 in the morning was the hour of tradesmen, emergencies, and men who had spent the previous night thinking very hard about something and arrived at a conclusion before propriety had fully woken up. Florence was in the breakfast-room, still in her morning dress, when Barker, the Bartlett household's ancient, magnificently disapproving butler, appeared in the doorway, wearing the expression of a man delivering complicated news. "The Duke of Callum," said Barker, "is in the front drawing-room." Florence set down her tea. Across the table, Aunt Golda made a sound like a woman who has been struck by lightning and is choosing to experience it as an opportunity. "Tell him," said Golda, rising with the speed of a woman 20 years younger, "that we will receive him immediately. Florence," her eyes cut across, "go upstairs and change." "I'm perfectly—" "Change." Florence changed. She did it quickly, in the functional way of someone who has dressed herself without a lady's maid for the better part of a decade, and was back downstairs in 7 minutes in a morning dress of pale grey that was clean, pressed, and entirely without distinction. Ruby was already in the drawing-room when Florence arrived, positioned in the chair nearest the window, where the morning light was most flattering,
wearing a dress of soft yellow that Florence would have needed 3 weeks' notice and a different face to carry off. Ruby's expression was composed, warm, and completely unreadable. The Duke was standing by the fireplace. He looked, Florence noted, with the detachment she was working very hard to maintain, as though he had also spent the night thinking. There were no obvious signs of dissolution. He was impeccably turned out, because of course he was, but there was something in the set of his jaw that spoke of decisions made at 3 in the morning and not reconsidered. "Miss Bartlett," he said, when Florence entered. His eyes went to her immediately, which was noticed by everyone in the room and commented upon by no one. "Your Grace," said Florence, "this is unexpected. I said I would address the matter in the morning. I assumed that was a figure of speech." "I rarely speak in figures," said the Duke. He glanced at Golda and Ruby with the brief, courteous acknowledgment of a man who is aware of his audience and decided to proceed anyway. "I wonder if I might have a private word with Miss Florence Bartlett." The silence that followed contained approximately 4 different conversations happening simultaneously without any words being spoken. Golda's silence said, "This is highly irregular, and I am simultaneously furious and calculating." Ruby's silence said, "I am watching every single thing that happens in this room, and I will not forget any of it." Florence's silence said, "Please, for the love of everything, let this be a sensible conversation." "You may use the small sitting room," said Golda, finally, with the graciousness of a woman who has decided that controlling the situation requires first allowing it to proceed. "I will leave the door open." "Of course," said the Duke. The small sitting room was, predictably, not small enough. Florence sat in the chair nearest the door, pragmatism, not nerves, and the Duke remained standing, which she appreciated because it would have been somehow worse if he'd sat down and made himself comfortable. "Well," she said. "I have been giving the matter considerable thought," he said. "As have I. I believe if you write to Lady Dynevor this morning with a sufficiently compelling, 'I don't intend to correct it.'" Florence looked at him. "I am aware," he said, with a careful delivery of someone who has rehearsed this and is now discovering that rehearsed things sound different when said aloud, "that this is not what you would choose. I am also aware that I am the cause of your current difficulty, and that gives me a responsibility to offer a solution that serves your interests as well as my own." "Your own interests," Florence said slowly. "What are your interests precisely? Because from where I am standing, you made a careless error, and the simplest correction is, 'It was not careless,'" he said. The room went very still. Florence studied him. "I beg your pardon?" Jonathan Calame had the look of a man who has just said more than he planned to, and is now committed to the road. "I had been steered toward your cousin all evening by Lady Roosevelt, by my secretary, by the collective expectation of the entire ton, which had apparently decided the matter without consulting me. And then I walked into, a brief pause, you, and I found myself having the first genuine conversation I'd had in 3 months." Florence opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. "I don't want to marry your cousin," he said, with flat, unambiguous clarity. "I don't know her. I've spoken to her twice, on occasions arranged specifically for the purpose of me finding her charming. She is," he paused, apparently searching for courtesy, "very decorative." "She's also considerably more than decorative, which you would know if you'd spoken to her for 10 minutes the way I spoke to you." Florence stopped. "I am proposing a courtship," said the Duke, "a real one, conducted publicly, giving the ton exactly what it thinks it already saw last night. 6 weeks.
At the end of 6 weeks, if you find the prospect intolerable, we part by mutual agreement, and I accept full social responsibility for the dissolution. Your reputation emerges intact. Your cousin may be presented the following season without the shadow of last night hanging over the family." Florence stared at him. "And if I find it tolerable?" she said, because she was constitutionally incapable of not asking the question that mattered. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something that lived in the same neighborhood. "Then we discuss what comes after tolerable." Florence looked at her hands, at the window, at the middle distance where sensible decisions theoretically lived. 6 weeks, a fake courtship, a duke who had handed her roses in front of 300 people and was now apparently declining to apologize for it. She thought about Aunt Golda, about the house in which she lived on sufferance, the allowance that barely covered her necessities, the 3 seasons of lemonade and pillars and invisibility stretching backward and forward in time like a corridor with no doors. She thought about Ruby, rigid in the carriage. She thought about the 10 minutes by the refreshment table, and the almost laugh, and the completely genuine question, "What do you find worth answering?" and the terrible, inconvenient fact that she had gone home and lain awake not thinking about the scandal, but thinking about the question. "This will devastate my cousin," she said. "Your cousin," said the Duke carefully, "will have every advantage I can reasonably provide, a proper introduction to the most eligible men of the season, a letter of endorsement from my household to any family she wishes to pursue connection with, and the graceful narrative that she nobly stepped aside for a prior claim. Society will call her magnanimous. It may improve her prospects considerably." Florence looked at him sharply. "You've thought about this." "I spent the night thinking about this." "And if I say no?" "Then I correct the situation publicly, accept whatever damage that does to my reputation, and wish you a pleasant season." He said it evenly, without pressure. "I am not offering you a trap, Miss Bartlett. I am offering you a choice. I thought you might appreciate the distinction." Florence looked at him for a long, measuring moment. The choice. He had given her the choice, and framed it as if that were obvious, as if it hadn't occurred to him to do anything else, and that small, uncalculated thing, was considerably more dangerous than everything else he'd said combined.
6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. And you will manage the situation with my cousin yourself. I will not be the one to tell her. Something crossed his face that was, she thought, genuine relief. Agreed. Florence stood. She smoothed her grey dress with the practical efficiency of a woman who has made a decision and intends to live with it. "Then we have an arrangement," she said, "and, Your Grace, if you ever hand me flowers again without warning, I will throw them directly into the nearest ornamental fountain." This time he did smile, small, swift, and absolutely devastating. "I'll bear that in mind," said the Duke of Calam. From the corridor, Florence heard Aunt Golda's barely contained breathing and knew that the door had been, for the last several minutes, considerably less open than advertised. She walked out to face the consequences. In which Florence becomes visible and discovers this is significantly more uncomfortable than invisibility. Visibility, Florence discovered, was exhausting. Within 48 hours of the Rochevelle ball, the story had achieved the particular velocity of ton gossip that meant it had stopped being gossip and become fact. Not accurate fact, the version circulating the drawing rooms bore roughly the same relationship to what had actually happened as a watercolor copy bears to the original painting, recognizable in outline, dramatically altered in detail, and considerably more romantic. The version Florence encountered most frequently at the Pendleton morning concert, her first public appearance since the ball, attended in the company of a stone-faced Aunt Golda and an eerily pleasant Ruby, went approximately as follows. The Duke of Calam had seen Florence Bartlett from across the Rochevelle ballroom, struck by some ineffable quality that the teller generally described as either beauty or spirit, depending on their disposition toward the romantic. He had crossed the room directly, ignoring every other woman present, and presented his flowers with an expression of such obvious devotion that Lady Dynevor had been moved nearly to tears. She was not moved to tears, told Will Thompson, the Duke's secretary, who had materialized at her elbow during the concert's interval with the apologetic efficiency of a man delivering uncomfortable information. The Duke asked me to tell you that he intends to call this afternoon, if that is convenient.
It is not particularly convenient, but I suspect that is irrelevant. His Grace also said, Thompson consulted a small card, and I am quoting directly, "Tell her that tuberose headache has been confirmed. 4 people. She was right." Florence looked at the card, then at Thompson. He kept track. He keeps track of most things, Miss Bartlett. It's rather his defining characteristic. Florence filed this information in the part of her mind she was trying very hard not to let get too full. She turned to survey the room and found it surveying her back. This was the new reality, being looked at, being assessed. Matrons who had never registered her existence were suddenly regarding her with the focused interest of women recalibrating a social calculation. Young women who'd spent 3 seasons treating her as furniture were offering tentative smiles of uncertain intent. And the men, this was the strangest part, some of them were also looking, because the Duke of Calam's attention was the most powerful endorsement in London, and a woman who had attracted it was suddenly, retroactively, worth noticing. Florence found the whole thing slightly nauseating. "You're doing it again," said Ruby, appearing at her left elbow. "I'm not counting crystals. It's a concert hall. You're cataloguing the room." Ruby's voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not unpleasant exactly, but they had the quality of a surface that you could not see beneath. "You've named everyone who's looked at you in the last 5 minutes." Florence opened her mouth to deny this. "You do it when you're uncomfortable," Ruby said. "You always have." Florence closed her mouth. They stood side by side for a moment, which was not entirely unlike hundreds of other moments they'd shared at events like this, and yet entirely unlike them because the geometry had changed. Florence was no longer the shadow. She was, disconcertingly, the center. "He's going to call this afternoon," Florence said quietly. "I know." "Ruby, don't." Ruby's voice was still pleasant, still controlled. "Don't apologize again. I've had enough apologies. They're not useful." She lifted her chin slightly, in the gesture Florence had seen 1,000 times, that particular combination of pride and performance. "What I want to know is whether you actually want this. Not whether it's convenient, not whether it solves the problem, whether you want it." Florence looked at her cousin. Ruby's expression had cracked, just barely at the edges, enough to show the genuine question beneath the composure. "I don't know," said Florence honestly. Ruby was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is the most interesting thing you've ever said to me." Then the concert resumed, and the moment closed, and they stood side by side in the new, strange territory of a relationship that had shifted overnight and would never entirely shift back. When the Duke called that afternoon, Aunt Colda received him with a warmth that would have been alarming in its completeness if Florence hadn't understood the simple arithmetic underneath it. A Duke in the drawing-room erased a great many grievances. "You will take Miss Florence for a turn in the park," Golda announced, rather than suggested. "If Miss Florence is agreeable," the Duke said, with the mildest possible emphasis. Florence was, she decided, agreeable. The park was neutral territory,
public enough to be proper, open enough to allow real conversation, and Florence had the distinct impression they were both grateful for it. They walked at a pace that was neither leisurely nor hurried, which felt, she thought, like an accurate physical description of wherever they currently were. "You survived the concert," he said. "I was stared at extensively. I catalogued 42 people. 42. 43 if you count Lady Dynevor, but she was also listening to the music, so I've given her partial credit. That's generous of you. I'm a generous person." She glanced up. "Your secretary told me about the tuberose headaches. I thought you'd want confirmation. You thought I'd want to be right. Same thing in your case, I suspect." Florence opened her mouth, then discovered, to her mild irritation, that she couldn't argue with this. "Why are you doing this?" she asked instead. It came out more directly than she'd planned, but they had, she felt, established that direct questions were acceptable currency between them. "Genuinely, not the explanation you gave in the sitting-room. That was a plan, not a reason. Why?" The Duke walked 3 paces before answering. "Because I have spent 4 years," he said, "doing precisely what was expected of me. Rebuilding the estate, managing the title, attending the correct events, and being seen with the correct people, and considering the correct women for the role of Duchess, and it has been extraordinarily tedious." Florence considered this. "That's a very honest answer. You asked an honest question. And I am the least expected option available. You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in 4 years." He said it without particular emphasis, as a statement of simple fact, and that was worse than if he'd said it with warmth. Facts were harder to dismiss than feelings. Florence looked straight ahead at the path. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not going to become a different person because of this. I will continue to count things and say uncomfortable truths and be thoroughly interested in the wrong details. I don't know how to perform being someone I'm not, and I've never had sufficient incentive to learn."
"I know," said the Duke. "That doesn't frustrate you." He was quiet for a moment. "It's why I gave you the flowers." Florence stopped walking. The Duke stopped a pace ahead of her and turned. Around them, the park continued its afternoon performance. Children with hoops, dogs in optimistic pursuit of squirrels, carriages on the distant path, all the cheerful machinery of a London afternoon in full operation. And in the middle of it, Florence Bartlett stood on a gravel path, looking at a Duke who was looking at her with the steady attention of someone who has made a decision and is comfortable with it, and tried very hard to remember all the sensible reasons why this was complicated. She remembered them. She started walking again, but the distance between them, she noticed, had reduced by approximately half a step. She didn't correct it. "In which the Ton approves, which is somehow worse." The Ton, having decided that it approved of the Duke and Florence, became immediately insufferable about it. This was, Florence reflected, the peculiar cruelty of high society. It ignored you for years, and then, upon deciding you were interesting, attached itself to your life with the enthusiasm of a barnacle and the sensitivity of a battering ram. Invitations arrived. Actual invitations, addressed to Miss Florence Bartlett, not to Miss Ruby Bartlett and party. She received 3 morning callers in one day, 3 women who had spent the previous 3 seasons walking past her without acknowledgement, now perched in the Bartlett drawing-room, asking earnest questions about the Duke's temperament, his house in Wiltshire, and whether it was true he kept dogs. "It is true about the dogs," Florence said, because Thompson had told her, and she saw no reason to be coy about it. "How delightful,"
said Mrs. Coughlin, who had a daughter of marriageable age and was visibly recalibrating 3 seasons' worth of social strategy in real time. He seems a devoted sort of man. He seems a thorough sort of man, Florence said. Whether they're the same thing, I couldn't say. This answer was found charming, which Florence found disorienting. The dinners were worse. She was seated next to people rather than below the salt. She was asked opinions rather than to fetch things. Lord Chandran, a witty baronet who had previously looked through her at approximately 17 social events, now appeared beside her at the Gemmell musical evening and spent 20 minutes on a genuinely excellent conversation about the reform of the Corn Laws.
She found herself enjoying it. This was alarming. More alarming, the Duke was, in these public settings, good at this. Not the performance of courtship, she'd expected that, but the specific courtship of her. He remembered things. He referenced conversations. He appeared at the Gemmell evening with a small piece of paper that he slid onto her program without comment, and when she unfolded it discreetly, she found a list. Confirmed tuberose headaches. Final count 6. You were significantly correct. Florence looked at the paper, looked at him engaged in conversation with Lord Gemmell 3 seats away. He did not glance at her. She folded the paper and put it in her glove. She told herself this was filing evidence of the arrangement's progress. She was, again, lying to herself, and she was beginning to be tiresome about it. It was Ruby who named the problem, with the precision of someone who had been watching carefully and had finally seen enough. They were in Ruby's room, a rare thing, this late evening informality between them, while Ruby's maid finished her hair. Florence had come to discuss a scheduling conflict between 2 of the following week's events that both required Florence's attendance, and had been waylaid by Ruby's expression in the mirror. "You like him," said Ruby. "That's don't." Ruby met her eyes in the glass. "I have been watching you for 3 seasons. I know what you look like when you're performing social pleasantness, and I know what you look like when you're actually engaged. You are actually engaged." Florence said nothing. "He makes you laugh," Ruby said. "I've seen it twice now. Actual laughing, not polite laughing. You look startled every time, which suggests you haven't accounted for it." She studied Florence's reflection with an expression that was complicated and tired and older than her years. "Does he like you?" Florence thought about the paper in her glove. "I think," she said carefully, "that he finds me interesting. That's not what I asked. It's the best answer I have." Ruby was quiet for a moment, her maid's hands moving through her golden hair with practiced efficiency. "You know what Mother is planning, don't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. Florence did know. She'd overheard the conversation 3 days ago, Aunt Golda in the small downstairs study, speaking to Uncle Victor in the low, precise tones she used when she was installing a plan rather than proposing one. The plan involved the Duke becoming a permanent fixture. The plan involved Florence's improved social position being leveraged for the family's advantage. The plan involved a great many things, all of which treated Florence as a convenient mechanism rather than an actual person. "She means well," Florence said, because she was sometimes charitable to a fault. Ruby's expression in the mirror suggested she was less charitable. "She means to use you. She was furious when she thought you'd ruined everything. Now she thinks you've accidentally improved everything, and she is recalibrating accordingly." A pause. "She's not wrong that it could improve everything. If the Duke actually—" Ruby stopped. "But that requires him to actually, and I don't know if he does." Florence looked at her cousin's reflection. "Does it bother you, honestly?" Ruby was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "and no. And yes." She sighed, which was the most honest sound Florence had ever heard her make. "I wanted him because I was told I could have him. I'm not sure that's the same as wanting him. I barely know him." She met Florence's eyes. "Do you know him?" Florence thought about 10 minutes by a refreshment table, about 6 tuberose headaches, about a piece of paper in her glove.
"I'm starting to," she said. Ruby nodded slowly. She turned back to her reflection, and the vulnerable thing retreated behind the composure, and she was the diamond again, polished, beautiful, impenetrable. "Don't let Mother decide it for you," she said. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's yours." Florence looked at her cousin, really looked, perhaps for the first time, and saw a young woman who had been managed and positioned and presented her entire life, and who was, quietly and without drama, advising Florence not to make the same mistake. "Thank you," Florence said. Ruby shrugged one elegant shoulder. "Don't make it into something affecting. I'm simply being practical." Florence smiled and said nothing, because some gifts were better accepted without comment. In which there is rain, a library, and a conversation that changes the shape of things. It rained for 4 consecutive days in the second week of June, which had the effect of collapsing the entire social calendar into a series of indoor events that were somehow simultaneously more intimate and more claustrophobic than their outdoor counterparts. The Duke called every day. Florence told herself this was because he was thorough, because he had committed to the arrangement and was seeing it through with the systematic efficiency that apparently governed his approach to everything. She told herself this on the first day and the second, and by the third day she had simply stopped explaining it to herself and accepted the fact of it, which was progress of a kind. On the fourth day of rain, they ended up in the Bartlett household library. This was Golda's fault. She had intended them for the front drawing-room, which was more visible to callers and therefore more useful to her various schemes, but the drawing-room was occupied by Ruby practicing the pianoforte with the focused intensity of someone exorcising feelings through Beethoven, and Golda was unwilling to interrupt the practice on the grounds that Ruby needed the accomplishment credit. So, the library. The library was small and smelled of old paper and neglect. Uncle Victor's collection was extensive but uncurated, the acquisition habits of a man who bought books to have them rather than to read them. Florence loved it unreservedly. She watched the Duke take it in with the assessing eye of someone familiar with better libraries, and felt a preemptive flicker of defensiveness. "It's badly organized," she said. "I've been trying to fix it for 2 years, but there's always something more urgent." "What system do you use?" "I was attempting chronological by acquisition, but Victor can't remember when he bought half of them, so I've been defaulting to subject." "Subject is more useful." "That's what I thought. Victor disagrees. He believes alphabetical by author shows better at dinner parties." The Duke looked at a shelf of miscellaneous volumes with an expression she was beginning to recognize as contained amusement. "Does he host many dinner parties in the library?" "Remarkably few." He pulled a volume from the shelf, a somewhat battered natural history, and turned it in his hands. "Callum has a library," he said, "about 3 times this size. My father bought things with great enthusiasm and read nothing, so most of it is in the same condition as this. I've been going through it for 2 years. "Cataloguing?" "Attempting to." He replaced the volume. "I find it—" He paused in the way he did when he was choosing words with actual care. "Quieter than most things." Florence understood this perfectly. "Yes," she said, with the simple recognition of one reader identifying another. "Yes, exactly." He looked at her. The rain increased against the windows. Beethoven continued distantly from the drawing-room. The library was small and warm and smelled of paper, and Florence was abruptly, uncomfortably aware that there was approximately 5 feet between them, and that the chaperone situation was, strictly speaking, less rigorous than it ought to be. Golda had been called away by a household matter and had not yet returned, trusting, perhaps, that a library was insufficiently romantic to require supervision. Golda, Florence thought, had clearly never paid attention to the function libraries served in novels. "Can I ask you something?" she said, because conversation was safer than the silence. "You generally do." Why did you spend 4 years doing what was expected of you? You have the title, you have the resources, nobody can actually compel you to— Obligation, he said, simply. My father spent 20 years doing exactly what he wanted, regardless of consequence. The estate was in ruin. The tenants hadn't been properly provided for in a decade. 3 families had lost their homes because of decisions made in a gambling house. He looked at the window, at the rain running down in grey channels. I was 19. There wasn't anyone else. Florence was quiet. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, he said, with a quick, self-aware edge. I'm telling you because you asked an honest question. I know, she studied him. And now, 4 years on, the estate restored, the obligation discharged. Now you're still doing what's expected. Or you were until the tuberose incident. The tuberose incident, he repeated, with the almost smile.
Is that what we're calling it?
I'm open to alternatives. The flower catastrophe, the rose miscalculation, the beginning of something considerably more interesting than a season, he said, and the almost smile became real for just a moment, warm and unguarded, and there before she could fully register it. Florence felt something in her chest perform an action she considered deeply unhelpful. She looked at the bookshelf. That's a very significant thing to say. I'm aware. We have an arrangement, a practical arrangement. You said 6 weeks and— Florence. It was the first time he'd used her given name, without title, without ceremony, just her name in his voice, quiet and direct, and it was such a small thing and so completely devastating that she had to look at the natural history spine very intently for several seconds. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't say things like that if you don't mean them. I have spent 3 seasons being entirely invisible, and I am— She stopped, recollected herself, continued more levelly. Not practiced at distinguishing between someone who means something and someone who is being charming because it's useful. So if this is useful to you, please just— It is not useful to me, he said. It is, in fact, significantly complicated. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the direct, unguarded attention she was beginning to recognize as his specific version of vulnerability. A man who had armored himself in capability and competence for so long that honest feeling showed on him like light through a window, unexpected and illuminating. I know who you are, he said. I knew who you were before I gave you the roses. Not your name. I didn't know your name, but you. The person standing by the pillar, counting things and being thoroughly unperformed. I had been looking at you for 20 minutes before you walked into me. Florence stared. 20? You were talking to a footman about the flower arrangement. You had the same expression you get when something has genuinely interested you. You go very still, and then you start talking, and you forget to manage your face. He paused. I noticed. You were supposed to be noticing my cousin. I was supposed to be doing a great many things. The rain against the windows, the distant Beethoven, the library warm and small and entirely inadequate as a setting for decisions of this magnitude. Florence said, Jonathan. She hadn't planned to use his name. It simply happened. And in the moment after it happened, they both held very still. The way you hold still when something fragile has landed unexpectedly, and you're not sure yet if it will stay. Yes, he said quietly. I think, Florence said, with the measured honesty of a woman who has decided that this particular moment deserves directness, that this arrangement has become something other than an arrangement. Yes. I think that is either a very good thing or a very bad thing, and I don't know which yet. Neither do I. But I think we should— She paused. I think we should keep going and find out. The door opened. Aunt Golda appeared, assessed the library, found it acceptably configured, and settled into the chair by the door with her embroidery and the expression of a woman entirely satisfied with the direction of events. Florence and the Duke of Calam looked at each other across the small, warm space. He smiled, small and real, and entirely for her. Florence looked at the bookshelf and thought about the paper still in her glove. 4 more weeks, she thought. It was, she was discovering, not enough time. In which everything falls apart because it had to. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Florence found it on the breakfast table, addressed in an unfamiliar hand, sealed with a small embossed D that it took her several seconds to place. She broke the seal. It was from Lady Dynevor. It was brief, politely worded, and the most threatening thing Florence had read since the terms of her father's will. "My dear Miss Bartlett," it read, "I hope this note finds you well. I confess I have hesitated to write, as the matter concerns individuals I hold in the highest regard, but my conscience compels me. It has come to my attention that certain parties within your family circle are pursuing a course of action that, should it come to light publicly, would cause considerable damage to your situation and to the Duke's. I would be happy to discuss the particulars at your earliest convenience. I remain, of course, entirely discreet. Yours, Lady P. Dynevor." Florence read it twice. Then she went to find Aunt Golda. Golda was not at breakfast. She was not in the small sitting-room, not in the drawing-room, not, when Florence checked with Barker, in any of her usual morning locations. She had, Barker reported, with the diplomatic neutrality of a man employed for discretion, gone out early with a sealed letter. Florence stood in the hallway and felt the specific cold of a thing she had half expected materializing into certainty. She thought, what has she done? She thought, I need to know before it reaches him. She was in the front hall with her pelisse on before she had fully formed the thought, and in a hackney carriage headed for Calem House before Barker had finished expressing his reservations about unaccompanied travel. Calem House was the sort of building that had been designed to make visitors feel the weight of centuries before they'd made it past the front steps. Florence had been inside twice for formal calls in the company of Aunt Golda, and had found it magnificent and somewhat exhausting. Arriving alone, unannounced, at 10 in the morning was a different experience entirely. Thompson received her in the entrance hall with an expression of surprise he managed professionally. "Miss Bartlett, the Duke is—" "I know I haven't an appointment. I need to see him." She paused. "It's urgent." Thompson looked at her face and apparently found sufficient evidence. "This way." The Duke was in his study, a room that was, she noticed despite everything, wall-lined with books actually organized by subject, and he rose when she came in with the expression of someone who has read a situation in the first second and is already 3 steps into managing it. "What's happened?" he said. She gave him the letter. He read it. His face did not change appreciably, but his jaw set in the particular way she had learned meant he was working to keep it still. "Do you know what she means?" Florence asked. "I have a hypothesis." He set the letter on his desk. 2 days ago, my solicitor received an inquiry from a representative of your uncle about the terms of any potential settlement arising from an engagement between us. Florence felt the room briefly rearrange itself. "Victor," she said. "Your aunt, I suspect, though the letter came through your uncle. They were inquiring with considerable specificity about what financial arrangement I would be prepared to make to the family in the event of a match." He paused. "Florence, they have been operating on the assumption that this courtship will end in an engagement since approximately the 3rd day of it. I know. Did you—" "I knew they hoped for it. I didn't know they'd written to your solicitor." She pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly. "What did your solicitor say?" "That he would take the matter under advisement and respond appropriately, which means he forwarded it to me." The Duke's expression was controlled and careful. "Lady Dynavor's note suggests it's gone further than a letter, that she knows something about whatever your family is doing." Florence sat down in the chair that was not the one she'd been directed. She sat down because her legs had arrived at a decision before her brain had caught up. "This is the part where you realize this is complicated in ways that make the arrangement less attractive."
"Florence, no, I'm being practical. You entered into this in good faith. The situation has now involved family financial maneuvering that was done without my knowledge or consent, and which makes the whole thing look considerably less like a genuine courtship and more like a—" She stopped. The word she was looking for was scheme. "You should know that I did not know." He had come around the desk. He was, she realized, standing quite close. "I know you didn't know," he said. "You can't be certain of that. I am entirely certain of that. Why? Because I know who you are." He said it with the same quiet certainty with which he'd said it in the library. "I told you, I know who you are." Florence looked up at him and felt the terrible, clarifying pressure of a moment that has decided to be definitive, regardless of your readiness for it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'm going to ask Lady Dynevor to meet with us together," he said, "because whatever she knows, it is better managed openly than quietly. And then I am going to have a conversation with your uncle." A pause. "And then I am going to continue this courtship." Florence stared. "After all of—" "Florence." He said her name with the same simple directness as before, and she had not become any better at receiving it. "I am not continuing it because of the ton. I am not continuing it because of obligation or arrangement or the 6-week framework I invented because I needed a reason to see you every day that didn't sound as excessive as the actual reason." He stopped. "The actual reason," he said more carefully, "is that I have been looking for someone like you for considerably longer than 4 years, and I am not inclined to surrender the finding because your aunt wrote an ill-advised letter to my solicitor." Florence opened her mouth, closed it. Something in her chest that had been wound tight for 23 years made a sound like a key turning in a lock. "That," she said, "is the most alarming thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know." He almost smiled. "Would you prefer I continue the tuberose comparison format?" "I would prefer," Florence said with great precision, "that you give me approximately 5 minutes to compose myself, after which I intend to respond to that statement properly." He stepped back. He gave her the 5 minutes. He looked at his books. She looked at her hands. She thought about 3 seasons of Lemonade and Pillars. She thought about a piece of paper in her glove. She thought about a library in the rain, and a man who had been watching her for 20 minutes before she walked into him. She thought, "He knows who I am." She thought, "I think I am beginning to know who he is." She thought, "This is either a very good thing or a very bad thing." She had already decided which. "In which Lady Dynevor proves unexpectedly useful, and a family has a reckoning." Lady Dynevor received them the following morning in a sitting-room that was a masterpiece of deliberate intimidation, every surface covered in evidence of social consequence, every chair positioned to give the occupant maximum visible authority. She was, Florence had always privately thought, the most purely political person in London. She was also, it turned out, fundamentally decent, which was the sort of discovery that required significant recalibration. "I wrote to you," she told Florence, "because I have watched your family manage you for 3 seasons, and I found it distasteful. And because," she paused with the expression of someone making a small concession, "I have a daughter, had a daughter." A brief, closed look. "She was the kind of girl who would have counted the crystals. I was not always patient with it."
Florence was not sure what to do with this information. "The letter your uncle sent," Lady Dynevor continued, turning to the Duke with the briskness of someone returning to practical ground, "was not subtle. He included language that implied the courtship had been deliberately orchestrated by your family, Callum, to form a financial alliance. Specifically, that you had been approached by the Bartletts with a proposal and had agreed to the arrangement in exchange for considerations I won't repeat in mixed company." The Duke's expression was absolutely flat. "He implied," Florence said slowly, "that Jonathan paid for it," Lady Dynevor said, "or agreed to pay. The letter was, frankly, libelous, and it has reached 3 households that I know of, and probably 6 that I don't." Florence felt cold, then hot, then the specific, clarifying fury of someone who has been used as a mechanism by people she had tried for 23 years to believe were doing their best. "He wants money," she said. "He wants to threaten the Duke's reputation until he pays to silence it. That is my interpretation, yes." Florence looked at the Duke. His jaw was doing the still thing. "Jonathan." "I'm not going to be extorted," he said, with the flat certainty of someone stating a weather fact. But more immediately, he looked at Florence. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm furious. Is that all right?" "Considerably preferable to the alternatives." Lady Dynevor watched this exchange with an expression Florence couldn't entirely decode. Then she said, "There is a way to manage this. It requires speed, a certain theatrical commitment, and Miss Bartlett's willingness to withstand one final public spectacle." Florence looked at her.
"Tell me," she said. The plan was, Florence had to concede, extremely good. Lady Dynevor would host a small dinner, intimate, perhaps 30 guests, the specific 30 guests whose social weight would make whatever occurred within the room immediately definitive, at which the Duke would publicly address the circulating rumor with the particular combination of cold authority and stated contempt that only a man of his standing could deploy to fatal effect. The letter would be characterized accurately as the fabrication of a disgruntled family member attempting financial coercion. And Florence, by being present at his side, composed and real and entirely herself, would render the rumor not merely false, but absurd. "This requires," the Duke said as they left Lady Dynevor's house, "that your uncle's scheme be publicly neutralized." "Yes." "Your aunt will be—" "I know what my aunt will be." Florence walked steadily. "I've been afraid of my aunt's reactions for 23 years. I find I'm significantly less afraid of them this morning than I was yesterday." He looked at her. What changed? She thought about it honestly. "I stopped trying to be grateful," she said. "I've been grateful for their roof and their food and their tolerance, and I've been so busy being grateful that I forgot that gratitude isn't the same as debt." She paused. "My father left me a small income that my uncle has been managing since I was 11. I've never asked the particulars. I think perhaps I should." "I think perhaps you should," the Duke agreed. There was a silence that was, Florence thought, the comfortable kind, the kind that had started appearing in the last week, the silences that didn't need filling because the presence within them was sufficient. "Whatever the dinner produces," she said, "I want to be clear that I'm doing it for myself, not for the arrangement, not for— I know. I'm mean to say, I'm not doing this because of what you said in the study. I haven't decided yet about what you said in the study. I know that too. You're being very accommodating." "I'm giving you room," he said. "There's a difference." Florence looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, and his profile was, in the morning light, exactly as pronounced as she'd first noted, and she was so thoroughly tired of pretending that noting this was neutral. "Jonathan." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the room." He nodded, once, in the way he had that communicated things he hadn't yet said. She walked beside him and thought about what she intended to say when she'd decided.
She was, she found, quite close to deciding. In which the Duke is magnificent, Florence speaks her mind, and Ruby does something unexpected. Lady Dynavor's intimate dinner was, as promised, a masterpiece of precision. The 30 guests were the 30 right guests, those with the social weight to make their witness definitive, those with enough intelligence to understand the purpose of the evening, and, in 3 crucial cases, those who had already received Victor Bartlett's insinuating letter and were awaiting clarity with the careful patience of people who had not yet decided what to believe. Florence wore her best dress, which was a deep green she'd bought 3 seasons ago and saved for important occasions. She had so rarely had important occasions that it had barely been worn. She wore it now with the straightened spine of a woman who had, in the last 48 hours, done the emotional accounting of her life and arrived at a balance sheet she finally understood. The Duke arrived before her, because he was the kind of man who arrived before her. She had learned this about him, this habit of placing himself between her and the entrance of rooms, so that she had somewhere to arrive to, rather than arriving alone into open space. She wasn't sure he did it consciously. She thought, perhaps, he did. He saw her immediately. She saw him see her, and she let herself receive it without flinching. Lady Dynevor introduced the evening over the soup course with the smooth efficiency of someone who has been managing social situations for 40 years and finds them straightforward. "I understand," she said to the table at large, "that there has been some confusion circulating about the nature of the Duke of Callum's courtship of Miss Florence Bartlett. I thought it simplest to address the matter in good company, as clarity is so much more useful than speculation." The table attended. The Duke spoke. He was, Florence had known he would be, exactly what the moment required: measured, authoritative, precise. He addressed the letter, without naming its author, which was somehow more devastating than naming him, as the fabrication of a party with financial motivations that he had referred to his solicitor. He expressed, with the particular cold composure of a man whose anger was entirely controlled and therefore entirely visible, his confidence that the assembled company would find such a fabrication beneath consideration. He then looked at Florence in front of 30 witnesses and said, "Miss Bartlett has done me the considerable honor of allowing me to make my intentions known. I intend to repay that honor appropriately." Florence held his gaze. She felt 30 pairs of eyes, and she looked at him, and she thought, yes. "Beautifully done," murmured Lord Chandran from her left. "Rather," Florence agreed. Across the table, Lady Dynevor was doing something that Florence strongly suspected was the older woman's version of satisfied.
The evening's only complication arrived at the dessert course in the form of Ruby Bartlett. She had not been invited. Florence hadn't known she'd come until she appeared in the dining-room doorway in a dress of deep blue that she wore with the upright composure of someone who has made a decision and arrived at its execution point. Lady Dynevor raised an eyebrow. "Miss Ruby Bartlett?" "Lady Dynevor." Ruby's voice was perfectly steady. "I apologize for the intrusion. I came because there is something that ought to be said, and I believe I should be the one to say it." The dining room, which had been prepared to wind down, reconvened its attention. Ruby looked at the assembled table with the clear-eyed steadiness of someone who has spent a season learning the distance between performance and truth, and has chosen, tonight, the latter. "My father wrote that letter," she said. "I didn't know he'd done it until this morning, and I am not here to defend it. What he did was wrong." She paused. "My cousin, Florence, has spent 3 seasons doing everything asked of her without complaint, and she deserves," her voice held just barely, "considerably better than she has received from my family, including from me." The table was absolutely silent. Ruby turned to Florence.
I wanted to say it publicly, she said, because the damage was public, and because you deserve to have someone from your family say it where it counts. Florence looked at her cousin, her difficult, proud, genuinely complicated cousin, and felt something shift in the architecture of a relationship that had always been built on unequal ground. "Ruby," she said quietly. "Don't make it affecting," said Ruby, with just enough of her usual composure to make Florence smile. "No, of course not." Lady Dynevor recovered first. "Miss Ruby Bartlett," she said, with something that was, from this woman, the highest order of compliment. "You may have any seat you like."
In which a duke says what he means, and Florence answers him properly. They were the last to leave. This happened naturally, the way things between them had a habit of happening, without engineering, without design, simply the accumulated consequence of two people who preferred to let a room clear before saying the things that mattered. Lady Dynevor excused herself with the discretion of a woman who has arranged the evening for exactly this conclusion, and Thompson, somewhere distant, was undoubtedly finding things to organize. The sitting-room held the pleasant wreckage of a successful evening, half-empty glasses, candlelight at the low end of its life, the particular warmth of a room that has been full of people and is now gratefully empty of them. Florence stood by the window. Outside, London was its late-night self, carriages and lamp-lighters, and the distant sound of something that might have been music. "Ruby was extraordinary," she said. She was. He was across the room, and then by the simple process of him not staying across the room, he was somewhat less across it. "Are you all right?" "I keep being asked that." "It keeps being relevant." Florence looked at the window. "My uncle is going to be furious. My aunt is going to be— I don't have a word for what my aunt is going to be. I have no idea what my living situation looks like tomorrow morning." She paused. "That should be frightening." "Is it?" She considered. "No," she said, with some surprise. "It isn't. Isn't that peculiar?" "You have resources," he said quietly. "Whatever your uncle has been managing, your father's income is yours. My solicitor will ensure that is clearly established." "You've already spoken to him about this?" "Yesterday." Florence turned from the window. He was, she found, closer than she'd tracked him, which she was choosing to interpret as evidence of distraction rather than poor spatial awareness on her part. "Jonathan," she said. "Florence." "In the study," she said, "you said several things, significant things. I told you I needed 5 minutes to compose myself and then respond properly." She met his eyes. "I believe I've had sufficient time." Something in his expression opened slightly, the way a window opens, carefully, letting in what it lets in. "I find you," she began, stopped, restarted. "I have spent 3 seasons being overlooked. I had made a kind of peace with it, not a happy peace, but a functional one. And then you walked through the Rose Houvelle ballroom and noticed me before I noticed you, and handed me roses in front of everyone, and then had the absolute audacity to not regret it, and I want you to know that was enormously inconvenient." His mouth curved. "I find you," she continued, because she was going to finish this properly, "the most interesting person I have encountered in 3 years of active, close-range observation of the upper echelons of English society. I find that you remember things, and tell the truth, and give people room, and make terrible jokes about tuberose, which is to say, you make one joke about tuberose, but it was good. I find that I have been thinking about you at 7 in the morning, which is significantly too early to be thinking about anyone voluntarily." She paused. "And I find that I am no longer interested in the question of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, because it simply is a thing, and it appears to be mine, and I would like to keep it." The room was very quiet. "That," said the Duke of Callum, "was worth waiting for." "I thought you'd think so."
He crossed the remaining distance between them, and Florence, who had spent 23 years being reasonable and practical and thoroughly invisible, found that she was none of those things right now and felt no inclination whatsoever to correct it. "I should like to speak to your uncle tomorrow," he said, with a specific purpose in mind, "if that is agreeable." "It is," Florence said, "significantly agreeable." "Significantly," he repeated, and the almost smile had become the real one, the warm, unguarded one, the one she planned to know very well for a very long time. She looked up at him. "You're going to hand me flowers again, aren't you?" "White roses," he confirmed, "proper ones, with full awareness of what I'm doing." "I retract my threat about the fountain." "I thought you might." Outside, London carried on being London, glittering and gossiping and arranging and rearranging itself in the endless pursuit of advantage. 300 members of the Ton were at this precise moment discussing the events of Lady Dinever's dinner with the enthusiasm of people who have been giving excellent material. They would say by morning that it had been obvious from the beginning, that of course the Duke of Callum, who had spent 4 years looking for something real, had found it beside a refreshment table in a grey muslin dress, that of course the woman who counted crystals and told the truth about tuberose was exactly what that particular man had needed, that it had been, in retrospect, perfectly inevitable. They would be, for once, almost entirely right. What the Ton said after, and what actually happened. The Ton, in the weeks that followed, produced several competing narratives about the Callum courtship, as the Ton inevitably does. The romantic faction, led somewhat improbably by Lady Dinever, who had apparently decided that the whole affair reflected well on her instincts, held that it had been love at first sight, that the Duke had known the moment he saw her, and that the flowers had been an act of inspired romantic genius rather than a minor navigational failure near a refreshment table. Florence found this version charming and inaccurate, and allowed it to circulate, because accurate versions are usually less interesting, and she had learned to be selective about her corrections. The practical faction, which included most of the older married women, who tended to view romance with the experienced skepticism of people who had seen several, said it was an excellent match, sensibly made, with a great deal of common ground and complementary temperament, and that the Duke's resources, combined with Miss Bartlett's very evident intelligence, would produce, in time, a well-managed household, and probably several children with excellent critical faculties. This version Florence also found charming and considerably more accurate. The small aggrieved faction, which included approximately 3 people, one of whom was Aunt Golda and one of whom was Victor Bartlett, who was currently engaged in a legal discussion with the Duke's solicitor that he was finding thoroughly uncomfortable, said a great many things that were not worth repeating. What actually happened was this. Florence moved out of the Bartlett household on a Tuesday, with her books and her grey pelisse and the small income that Victor had been managing with considerable personal benefit for 12 years, and which the solicitor had now recalibrated to its proper purpose. She moved into a modest set of rooms in a respectable part of town, arranged by Lady Dinever, with the efficiency of a woman who has been wanting to do something useful for approximately 30 years and has finally found the occasion. She found it, the independence, exactly as she'd suspected she would. Occasionally uncertain, frequently complicated, and profoundly, entirely her own. Ruby, in the same month, was introduced by the Duke, as promised, to 3 families of excellent standing who had not previously been accessible to the Bartletts. She met at a musical evening in July a Scottish baronet named Sir Rupert Young, who was bookish and slightly awkward, and found Ruby's composure both beautiful and inexplicable, which she found inexplicably charming. By September, she had decided she found him worth knowing. By the following season, the Ton would have a different match to discuss. Uncle Victor was, for the remainder of the summer, extremely quiet. Aunt Golda, to Florence's moderate astonishment, came to call in August.
She sat in Florence's modest drawing-room and looked at the books and the simple furniture and Florence herself, and she said, in a voice that was the closest to unguarded Florence had ever heard from her, "I did not treat you as I should have." Florence offered her tea. Golda stayed an hour. It was not a reconciliation. It was not nothing. It was, Florence thought, exactly what it was, a beginning of something more honest than what had come before, and that was enough. The Duke proposed on a Wednesday. Florence would later maintain that she had seen it coming from approximately the library afternoon in the rain, but she was sufficiently honest with herself to admit that seeing something coming and being prepared for it are entirely different experiences. And when Jonathan Calame, in the garden of Calame House, with white roses from his mother's garden in his hand, and the specific expression of a man who is not nervous exactly, but is paying complete attention, asked her, she found that 3 seasons of composure were entirely inadequate to the moment. She said yes. She said it clearly and without performance, and then she told him that if he ever required tuberose for any event she attended, she would hold him personally responsible for every headache in the room. He said he understood completely and would put it in the settlement. She said that was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. He said he'd worked on it. She laughed, actual laughing, startled laughing, the kind she still sometimes forgot to manage her face around, and he watched her do it with the expression she had catalogued and named in her private accounting, the one that meant, "This, specifically, is what I was looking for." She was not invisible. She was not a mechanism or a convenience or an afterthought or a chaperone or a wallflower or any of the words that had been used with varying degrees of kindness to describe the woman standing 2 feet behind the diamond. She was Florence Bartlett, future Duchess of Calame, crystal counter, floral critic, sharp-tongued keeper of uncomfortable truths, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. 300 members of the Ton had watched it happen. Lady Dynevor wrote about it beautifully. The tuberose count remained, for the record, at 6.